So quick announcements from me, and then I'm going to toss things over to Andrew. So we're good. We're all glad you're here. So welcome both attendees and panelists. Thank you guys so much for joining us for Cybersquatch 2020. My name's Eric. I am the tournament director for Swordsquatch. There's no tournament this year, so I'm doing other stuff. I've been with Swordsquatch since the beginning for 5 years. So it's about how long I've been doing that. We've got Carrie and Justin, who are our moderators today. Thank you guys for doing that. They're both great. Some quick reminders from this session from our conduct code. Black Lives Matter, be nice to each other, and please be patient with technical difficulties. If you fail to follow the code, we're gonna ban you, and you can watch it on YouTube later. If you need assistance, please use the comment box, and if you want to message one of our moderators or me, we can maybe help you out. And then, if you have a question to ask any of our panelists, which are Jude, Ledesma, Dillon, Beyer, Andrew, Somlyo, Mike Panian, and Stewart, Sackett, please post that in the Q&A, which is going to be next to the chat video. I'm not going to be trying to keep up with chat. I'm only going to be looking at Q&A. So I'll be handing questions off to Andrew via the Q&A. So that's where those go. Finally, that's actually it. So that's all it. Thanks so much. And Andrew, if you want to take over. I think you can unmute yourself. Oh, no, you can't. I lied.
Can you hear me now?
I'm just going to make all you guys co-hosts to clarify things.
Okay. You can hear me now, correct? This is
yes.
Good. All right. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Okay, this is the Ringen SmackDown panel. So we are talking about wrestling and historic European martial arts. I am your moderator, Andrew Somlyo. I am the founder of Seattle Eskrima, one of the early members of Lonin up here in Seattle, aka Longsword Ronin. I am one of the Fiore coaches with an interest in Fiore, Monte, and Body, among other things. My martial arts experience is pretty varied. Has been semi-professional in at various times. I've run a school. I have a decent a couple years of decent Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu under some good people. I've worked with some good stand-up wrestling coaches. Wrestled a little bit, done a little bit of MMA, and my general focus, done a bit of Muay Thai, and my general focus has been on clinch work really for a large portion of my training career. I'm moderating things today. I'm not going to chime in too much. I'll just try and keep conversation moving. Let's everyone else introduce themselves. Next, Mike Panian, please chime in.
Hi, I live in British Columbia in the interior, and I'm blessed right now with better weather and fire conditions than most of you, though I know that it can be bad. It can be bad here as well. My background is in karate and North American folk wrestling. I was a wrestling coach for a couple of years, and had the opportunity to also cross-train in some judo with a guy named Hayward Nishioka, and some Aikido stuff. So I'm looking forward to tonight's discussion.
Jude Ledesma, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Jude. HEMA background. I run a school in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, F3 Sword Academy, focusing on German traditions. Even though it's Renaissance stuff now, I've been taking a reverse time travel thing, so I'm getting much more interested in earlier material. My main background, though, is HEMA, sort of my side hustle. I'm mostly an MMA coach, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu brown belt. I'm the competition coach at Straight Blast Gym NorCal right now. And I've been training a long time, Filipino martial arts, wrestling, boxing, very similar to Andrew's background. which is probably why I dig them so much. But that's the way it goes. And Swordsquatch is one of my favorite things.
Dillon Beyer.
Hey, folks. As you may have guessed, I'm Dillon. Like I would suspect everybody here. I've done a little bit of a lot of stuff over a long time. Probably the lion's share of it is in full contact karate, boxing, and judo. I orbited HEMA for quite a while. I worked with the guys who run the Oakshott Institute in Minneapolis for a bit in the German stuff. Recently got sucked back in because there's a lot of good people I know who are involved, and I'm working my way through the different treatises based mostly on how sassy they are. So that's where I'm at.
Stewart Sackett, please tell us about yourself.
Hi, I'm Stewart. I'm a preschool teacher and jiu-jitsu coach in Portland, Oregon. I'm the Ringen coach, or medieval wrestling coach, that is, for Drive Under Western Martial Arts, which is a little sort of niche group that started things up in Portland several years ago now. I've been trying to convince the Pacific Northwest sword crew that wrestling is really fun too for many years now. It's really fun to hit people with swords, but it's also fun to throw people through the air and pin them to the ground. I don't know. That's me.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. Some administeria for folks here. If you have questions, please post them in the Q&A. One of the moderators will convey them to me, and I will put them to the panel. We're going to start out with a couple. We're going to be going by topic. We have sort of three main topics we're covering. To start with, what we're going to be talking about is what is the historic context of wrestling in Western martial arts? And the reality is, if you're doing anything from while we have texts from the 14th to the beginning of the 17th century, if you're studying a text, the people who wrote it knew how to wrestle. Period. Full stop. That would be the exception, not the rule, for people not to wrestle. When you look at 133, there are multiple infighting and clinch tactics that displayed within it that say, wow, okay, they knew how to do this. This was not some special skill. This was just, oh wow, get an overhook. Okay, that makes sense. It's not presented as being anything mystic or anything really of note within it. And I think that sort of says something under the baseline assumptions about the people who'd be doing it. When you look forward to Fiore, he overtly says, all fighting is wrestling. This is, the wrestling that we do here. There's the wrestling you do with your friends in company for sport and fun. This is not the wrestling we are doing here. It's like, it is, again, if you're doing Fiore and you don't wrestle, you're not doing Fiore, I would argue, simply because he's already said, yeah, that's what you have to do. When you look into the German tradition, again, the statement that all fighting is wrestling, the extensive pairing of Ringen, with sword work, it goes through the entire Lichtenauer tradition. You start to see that fade away then once you hit the beginning of the 17th century, and you can make arguments about that for like texts afterwards. Monte, again, if I can put in a plug for more people reading Monte, is again a beautiful example of all this is wrestling. Then he goes deeply into what the wrestling is, describes it extraordinarily nicely, and goes through the different styles of folk wrestling and the habits of the folk wrestler of 20 some odd nations of Europe, with the idea that you might need to know how to do all these things. Then he makes explicit examples going from folk wrestling to what you do in armor for wrestling. And so I've worked with some armored folks, and when you have to, and have helped them solve those problems, and it bears out pretty well. The stuff that you see Monte talking about, yep, yeah, it works. Yep, that is the stuff you need to focus on in that sort of form of wrestling. It is almost mandatory for you to look at things through this lens. That's sort of a general overview. What would people care to add? Dillon.
So one thing that has been interesting coming into HEMA relatively recently and looking through the source material, because there's a parallel I see a ton in some of the traditional, particularly classical Okinawan and Japanese arts, where what's usually transmitted doesn't explicitly include wrestling because the authors couldn't conceive of the fact that people hadn't been doing it since they were kids. Like Okinawa has massive traditional wrestling and sumo systems, and when most of the karate styles were formalized from the 1950s on, judo was already a mandatory part of curriculum for youth. So literally everybody entering the collegiate karate schools had been doing judo from the time they were 4 or 5 years old. Like it's such an intrinsic part of the assumption about the systems that what you see happen is when they're removed from the original context, like when they're exported through the GIs to the US, that's not in the table of contents, the wrestling part of the curriculum explicitly, because they felt it would be absolutely redundant to systematize and teach it in that context. And I see some of that in some of the HEMA work from what I've been seeing so far. That there's not there's no foundation of wrestling written in it because they can't picture a time or a place where everybody who's getting to their material doesn't already have that like bones deep in their background. I don't know if that lines up with anybody else's reading or experience with it.
Very much my take also. And I would, again, very, very much my take also on HEMA and very much my take on Okinawan martial arts. I'd add that when you start, in the same case, when you're looking at Northern Chinese martial arts, the assumption of jacketed wrestling or village folk wrestling is there. You can't really look at Taiji without saying, oh, wow, everyone here knew how to wrestle, because that's when you look at Chen village practices. It's an in-close wrestling system that they're practicing there. You'll see the same thing with certain forms of long fist, all the northern stuff. The southern less so. I don't know of good like southern systems. You can see the same thing popping up in Indian martial arts, where what little we have surviving of their bladed practices are deeply related to their wrestling practices, their wrestling implements. I mean, again, this is again looping back around. You see now many people in Western martial arts using Indian wrestling practices to attempt to inform their sword work, because it works well for both, unsurprisingly, which is part of it appears why that's conserved.
When I was wrestling and coaching, my wrestling coach, he said something that stuck with me. He said the purpose of wrestling is to obtain control of your opponent, throw them to the ground, dominate them, and pin them, and then destroy their resolve to fight. And he meant kill, but I sweetened it up a little bit. And that in the North American folk style wrestling is the kind of wrestling that everybody does in high schools and grade schools and colleges in the United States and in Canada. And it's a huge tradition in this country, in the United States. I grew up in Pittsburgh, so I was in the middle of it. And it goes way back through the Carney Professional Wrestling World Federation of Wrestling is what that evolved into, back to catch wrestling and colloquial wrestling practices that were intense and tough and painful. And those guys are still around, some of the old guys. And it's a colloquial practice that I think reaches back into medieval times as well. So it's like the stuff that Marco Corta does with dagger fighting and the traditions that he talks about, where the daggers, stuff that he learned from people in Italy came from hidden practices and the mafia and stuff, but it had roots in medieval times as well.
One other thing, Dillon talked about that element of misinterpretation that comes from the assumptions of the original author, that everybody knows this, so I don't have to write it down. But one of the differences between the historical practice of these martial arts and the modern recreation of these martial arts is, historically, everybody knew how to wrestle because they learned to wrestle when they were kids. They learned in a sporting system like what Mike grew up in, like modern collegiate wrestling, in that it was prevalent amongst youth. And a lot of the modern practitioners, we come to this as adults because swords are cool and we've saved up enough money to buy some now, and it's exciting. But there's a different way to learn a motor skill when you're 6 years old versus when you're an adult. And some of these physical activities are a little easier on the body when your bones are still rubbery. So when we get into how to train this stuff, the best practices changes depending on the age of the demographics sometimes. And I think that that can be an interesting interpretive hurdle, because there are things that are in the manuals that I would say, if you gave me a kid to train up as a swordsman, I would have them start with these wrestles. If you gave me a 40-year-old who started fencing last year, I might start them with something a little less high amplitude, for example.
Absolutely agree with that. I think there's some really interesting bits in the pedagogy to look at for, like, how do you, it's a good argumentative point for doing it with the goals that were in mind at the time versus doing it with the tools that they had at the time. Like trying to copy what they were trying to accomplish rather than trying to do things exactly the same way they did it. And if you don't have the ability to go back in time to when somebody was 5 and start their training then, like if anybody has that time machine, please let me know. I will entirely restructure how I trained and how I coach. But I think that's a really good and useful point, is that since we can't go back and reestablish the same precursors for the people who are walking in the door now, that's a really important consideration.
So that's one of the things that when we were organizing this and when we were talking last year about to kind of team teaching some wrestling stuff for Swordsquatch, that we were thinking about as a group. We were thinking about how do you introduce this stuff to older people or people that haven't been through it. A couple of weeks ago, this just came to my mind. Dillon gave a talk about karate and specifically some of the Goju-Ryu body hardening practices. And there's a parallel there. I was thinking about that there might be like the intention of body hardening practices in fighting in striking arts has the same effect that wrestling does. It inures your body to a certain amount of ability to take discomfort. You get a little body tough from doing it. And I think that's getting into the next part of this, some of the benefits, but yeah.
Well, before we start, like, I agree, before we start going forward with that,
yeah,
moving into the next piece, one thing I'd like to say about the historical piece that we also should probably point out. Wrestling is as close to an unbroken line of Western martial arts as we have. That is what Mike touched on. And that's the other thing to remember. If you are wrestling and you are doing a Western wrestling tradition and you are learning from someone who has done a Western wrestling tradition, when you go back generation by generation, you were getting the sweat on you from someone from 1,500 or 2,500 years ago. Like, it's something we've never stopped doing. Like, it is really the one historic art we have. Boxing gets lost. There's still wrestling. You know, we have a clean line, you know, the English systems that Mike was alluding to, we have a clean line back for those. We've been doing this the whole time. And that, again, is an important reason from a historic perspective. It's what we've got. And that's an important bit. Before we move on from the historic perspective and sort of talking about that, because we're not doing a full sort of lecture on history, are there any other points from either the panelists or the crowd that people would like to add to this?
Yes, we had one question, not a particularly serious one, but I think it's very important. Which book or source is the sassiest?
So far, I've got to go personally with Fiore in my assessment. It really reminds me of reading Spinoza's Ethics, where he's sorry, I have to pause because I have to remember this is public, so my language has to be a little different. Crap talking Descartes throughout the whole thing, knowing it was going to be published posthumously, and reading Fiore. I was really surprised to see reading Fiore felt exactly the same. It's just smack talk nonstop the whole way through.
Fury sounds like Ali to me, I gotta say. It's
Yeah.
like, yeah, Fury straight out like, I broke your limbs and took your dagger. What the hell is wrong with you? I am laughing at you. I stand on this one I ripped off. It's like, okay, man.
Yeah, I'm a fan of the German manuals myself, but in pure sassiness and consistent sassiness, I think you've got to give it to Fiore. If you look at Fabian von Oswald, some of his expressions are priceless. Yeah, in terms of consistently sassy language, I think you got to give it to Fiore.
I just have not read anything from that far back in history that sounded so much like "come at me, bro."
Yeah. There's some sources that Fiore for me and a couple other places where they really have that. When you've been hanging around fighting gyms for a while, they kind of sound like old punchy fighters, tend to talk. We'll not discuss certain manuals that may perhaps have a little bit of that, less of that sense. Moving on, the next one, and as Mike was alluding to it and was starting in on it, I think it is incumbent on us to move into the next topic, which is, okay, y'all should wrestle. Okay, if you're doing historic European martial arts, clearly when you look at this panel, we'll all tell you you should wrestle and you're a bad person if you don't. And we can all agree on that. But, moral judgments are not strong arguments. Why should you wrestle? The topic at hand is, what is the reason and what are the benefits past, okay, we're doing historic art and it's historic to do this. So I'd like Mike to take that from the start. So what do you think? What do you get out of wrestling?
Well, Dillon and I have actually been chatting together about this. So maybe if it's okay with you, we'll kind of have a conversation similar to what we had online. So the one thing that I think wrestling does is it gives you a primal connectivity to real combat. It in a way that is relatively safe, actually, for the amount of intensity that you can generate. There's nothing like having a guy. I mean, you can know a bunch of stuff. You can anecdotally know a bunch of wrestling techniques, but until you look across the mat at a guy who's looking you right in the eye, who wants to put you on your back, and then they try to do it, and you're trying to do the same thing to them, you're missing something. And so that primal connectivity to someone trying to take you out, that doesn't involve getting punched in the head or twisted up, broken in some way, and can involve twisting up, but there's a lot of ways to be safe, and I think we'll touch on that stuff later on. But so what do you think, Dillon?
Yeah, I thought per our previous conversation, this is part of the reason I like chatting with Mike. I immediately started breaking stuff down by like the neurological impact, what it's going to do physiologically to wrestle, that sort of thing. And then Mike was like, and in the end, it teaches you what a fight is. And I'm like, oh, right, duh, the most important thing you can get out of it, that was like this summation of it. I think that's a huge part of it. I think the moment where you learn to stop tapping to pressure that's not risky to you, anybody who's done any wrestling eventually will tap to somebody who's just holding them down and being heavy, not obstructing your airway, nothing that's ever going to amount to damage, but just through the sheer pressure of it. We jokingly call it positional asphyxiation. you just give up because it goes sort of directly to your guts. And there's something to be said for a training practice that can safely expose you to that, that then gives you the tools you need to. And it's one of the things martial arts talk about, character development all the time. To actually get character development, to actually be a stronger person, you've got to go through some stuff. And I think a lot of schools and styles miss that. They don't actually do the scary parts on the mat. And wrestling is amazing for being able to get into uncomfortable and scary positions that can be dialed to the edge of whatever your ability is at a given point in time, and can scale all the way up just shy of actual combat, or all the way down to the first day somebody walks onto the mat, you can do it. I think that's an incredible toolkit to have to develop a complete fighter and to develop a complete person.
And technically, the what that requires from us is a fitness level that is intense. It's an anaerobic and aerobic. It's local muscle endurance and just general ability to hang in there. And one of the conundrums of wrestling is that you, in order to wrestle well, to actually practice some of the techniques, you've got to be fit enough to do them. And the way you get fit enough to do them is emulating the movements, but that's hard to do. And so there's a circular problem that you have to slowly try to help with. It's a question of transition as well, technically. Like, we start off sword fighting or fighting at distance, and then we enter. And you can fight a tactical game largo, and then you can fight stretto, and then you can fight in grappling range. And by changing that, it's another way of using strategy. So there's also some other things that go along with that.
Yeah. Please, at any point, we're, for good reason, for happy reason, down a panelist. And Andrew recommended we drink an extra cup of coffee ahead of time for that, so blame him for this. Feel free to mute me at any point, because I did the extra coffee.
Me too. I'm just restraining myself. I forgot to say Brent Lambell's not here. I made a point saying we should say that. So Brent couldn't make it, unfortunately. He had some things come up. It's, again, the world is on fire, so there's an absence. Dylan, as you were saying, my apologies.
So yeah, I'll chatter until someone stops me. Anybody who's worked with me knows that. So please, somebody pump the brakes. The structure, when Mike and I had initially talked about this segment, we've been looking at the wrestling, the benefits of it through the perspective of the physical conditioning, and that's like Mike was saying, fitness levels, interconnection, body interconnection, all this stuff the Tai Chi guys are trying to get and the internal martial artists are trying to get. You get way faster wrestling. It's fantastic for proprioception and interoception. It's a really good way of showing you where your body is in all sorts of orientations at all sorts of times. And that's one of the best ways I know to get somebody coordinated. Armor building, as Mike was saying. I don't know a better way to build armor than to wrestle, and to do it safely without, like, one of the things everybody gets wrong with conditioning is they try to do it all at once, but you can't brush your teeth for an hour Sunday and then be good for a week. But doing a little bit of wrestling every day or every couple of days is going to go a long way towards making you really tough down the line. You get the psychological factors. It's really hard to intimidate somebody by getting up in their face if they've got 10 years of wrestling practice. It just takes away all of that sort of the looming intimidation effect. When somebody's like, yeah, I would rather fight you from inside your own clothing. That's fine by me. You wind up, Mike again alluded to the technical and tactical stuff. There's a lot you just can't do in sword play if you don't have that framework. And even something as simple as watching a good North American wrestler do a wrestling shot, that's some of the best way I've seen to get the hip drive necessary for an immediate untelegraphed passing step. Mike did a great thing on that, a great video on like showing how you develop power in that. So you wind up with physical conditioning, you wind up with psychological conditioning, you wind up with technical conditioning, and then you wind up with, if this is your jam and training, character development and spirituality from facing adversity.
So another aspect of that you reminded me of is the idea of flow drills. Like there are flow drills in lots of martial arts, sometimes called pity patty drills, where you're moving back and forth in a pattern. And if you have a wrestling background and you're trying to understand how to use some of the stuff that's in the manuals, like you'll see this stuff and you can go through it in a choreographing way, and you try to implement it, it doesn't work. It's hard you can't even see how to use it. But if you are coming from a wrestling background, then the first thing you're thinking about is how do you obtain control of the guy's center. And once you do that, then some of the stuff that you're looking at is actually easy to do. You also find the context that this kind of thing will work. So like another benefit to HEMA at large is to keep maturing this as a holistic martial art. Like instead of it turning into sword fighting, where guys are just standing at range doing this, if we also, that's fine, but if we also include a sense that's like this, and then going in on the guy and taking him down and using that, it changes the way the game works. And I think that has applicability to self-defense training in general. In any weapons martial art will also acknowledge that there's this transition from weapon to unarmed to grappling that happens in real life kind of fighting. So
Can I jump in?
yeah.
Please.
So talking about, Andrew said, everyone here on this panel will tell any of the viewers, you should wrestle because it will make you a good person, or at least if you don't wrestle, it means you're a bad person. But beyond that, if your study is HEMA and you're interested in the H, the historical part of HEMA, I'm saying this on behalf of Brent because he couldn't be here and he loves the history side of things. If you're interested in the historical side of HEMA, not just the modern competitive sport of longsword fencing, if you're trying to figure out why your exchanges don't look like what's in the manual, it's because people fight where they are comfortable. And the people who wrote the manuals were comfortable at wrestling range. And that informed some of their tactics and some of their distance management. If you look at some of the bigger wrestles in the manuals, especially the running through wrestles, and people will say, well, you don't see those a lot in modern HEMA tournaments. And what Brent would say, if he were here, is wrestling at the sword is a consensual activity. The big throws don't happen when the guy's running away trying to snipe at you and you decide to wrestle. The big throws are there as counters to the other guy trying to wrestle you. They happen when both guys close. And there are other wrestles that happen at longer range and at different ranges. But the things that we don't see consistently in the modern competition are cases where both competitors are comfortable enough with wrestling to meaningfully compete with each other there and remember at the same time they have swords. And a majority of people having their management of range dictated by their comfort with wrestling. And that changes the tone of the match. And I think when you see people with those attributes and those perspectives, what you see ends up looking a lot more like what we read about in those earlier manuals.
We have a question that I think is very relevant to this, especially as you mentioned the big throws. The question is, what are things that we can do, both as students and instructors, to have safe wrestling practices, especially if you don't come from a wrestling background?
Could you please message me with questions?
Oh, sure.
The answer to that one is we're talking about it later in the evening, I believe.
That's
Okay.
the entire third part.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Sorry, sorry. The thing I want to chime in on with that that I think is important also to remember when you look at wrestling. Wrestling is the structure of most longsword sparring and most competitive longsword often does not reward wrestling or is actively attempts to discourage it for safety reasons. Particularly, there's certain tournament structures and point structures that reward it and make it less likely to happen because it is not rewarded. Moreover, the structure of free motion in a flat space against one person without boundaries, without physical boundaries or walls, makes it so that wrestling is less likely to happen. If you need an example of this in much more modern history, look at all of tournament-based point karate or full contact karate or Lei performance, and then look what happened when you put a cage around it. If you need or a ring, like it was a ring in Brazil in the 40s, 50s when Vale Tudo started, but that's the other piece here. When out of bounds just means, okay, reset, that's one thing. When out of bounds means I've slammed you in a wall and we're going to have some fun now, that's a different thing. And if we ever start, you'll see this, again, this is interesting when you watch Bohurt, wrestling comes up all the time. And part of that is because the rules of Bohurt, that's part of also the nature of armor. Again, and if you wish to understand armor, you're going to need to know how to wrestle because that's how everyone had to do their business if they needed to get something done. It wasn't, executing some cunning play with striking with someone with a sword unless you're, being slick and sniping a palm or an eye hole. I'm quite sure people trained at and were good enough to do, but it's not the bulk of those armored treatises, you will note.
We saw the exact same thing in full contact in Knockdown for stuff from the mid 80s and earlier, where everybody had a judo background. And then in the styles that still allow and reward any of the takedown work versus the more contemporary sport karate stuff, in that not just that there were takedowns, but the stand-up changed when the takedowns were removed.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jude. I was going to change the subject. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. just one last thing about the boundary thing that Andrew put in. Yeah, and then other bodies on the battlefield perform the same issue as a boundary, right? If you're going to be running into other people or a horse or something, that leads into that wrestling as well.
Yeah, so Dillon and I had also talked about psycho-spiritual stuff, the biodynamic connection to your mentality. And so he alluded to this, he's talking about and I did too, about what it's like to actually face some intensity and in a way that you can amp it up and still kind of be relatively safe. But so I think that mind, body, and spirit are indeed actually interconnected, and they're different manifestations of the same thing. And so the way you carry yourself, the way and I also think that if I'm holding myself like this and I'm nervous, that my chances are less in terms of surviving. If I can figure out how to master my own energy and my own ability to face the terror of a real fight, and it is, if it's real, it's not a fun thing, then as a human being, I'm forced to face some things, and that helps me grow in general. So again, wrestling does this, and just looking back at some of the kids that I wrestled or that I coached, those guys would start off kind of incomplete, and they'd come at least where I was coaching, the guys that are on the basketball team came from that side of the tracks, and the guys that were wrestlers came from that side of the tracks, and those guys that were coming up, they're having trouble with some other things, and wrestling actually made them earthy and solid and stable. And 20 years later, when you run into one of those guys and they still got a neck that's this big and they're dragging a little kid along, you realize that they learn something more about themselves than just how to fight. So, Dillon, what do you got for that?
I was going to say, one of the weird tangents that I have found with that in the past, and wrestling is one of the spots that I think does it really, really well. You have like the Karate Kid stereotype of the kid who thinks like violence is the answer and all that kind of stuff. And then they go to a dojo and they learn it's not over time. And for dojos that don't have a certain degree of physicality incorporated, I've found that to often not be the case. What I think comes up really well in and why I think wrestling is useful for this is because you can provide an environment for that sort of person where they encounter somebody who is able to control them and would be able to what was it your teacher said, establish or dominate them when he meant kill them in an altercation.
Destroy their resolve.
Yeah, there we go. That's what we're going with. Destroy their resolve. But who can do that, but then elects not to, and elects to be merciful in a situation where they have absolute control. And I think that models a certain flavor of character that a lot of the times is the first step for people who've had a rough background to progressing further along.
Yeah.
In that, like, to me, that's one of the defining characteristics of that is that capacity, the capacity and the practice to be unmerciful and then to choose to not, I think is a really interesting social model to establish.
That's part of the tradition, isn't it? And more than in any other athleticism, that when I was growing up, when guys are wrestling, it's less so these days, to be honest with you. But when the tradition was, you did not cheer for yourself when you won. You got up, you shook hands, you wrestled, somebody won, somebody lost, you get up, you shake hands, you walk off the mat. And that was by design. That was the intention there, was to create humility in the guys that were getting powerful, prowess and character.
We used to see disqualifications for overt celebration when you'd win. Like if you won and you did the hand in the air cheer kind of deal. I've seen that at national level competitions result in a disqualification.
Same here.
That sends a really strong message in an interesting.
You can see, right?
Okay. I'm just going to look at my list here. Yeah, the other psycho-spiritual thing is this where does that, you don't have to be too intellectual about this stuff to find this value in this way. The two psychological dilemmas is what do you do when you're succeeding and what do you do when you're failing? When striking arts is how do you manage when you actually hit someone psychologically, and how do you manage when you get hit really good? And both of those are
real happy.
Yeah, both of those are psychological dilemmas that a lot of people will have a hard time with in various respects, and so that makes you have to think about this. And wrestling is a good place to do that kind of stuff. So,
if I might, I'd like to go through. I want to spend a little more time on this section, and I'd like to go through everyone and sort and be a little bit and ask about benefits around specifics in 3 areas, because I think we're sort of talking about them. So one area is the psychological benefits, right? Which we've alluded to, psychological and characterologic benefits. And I want to lead with that. And so if we can talk about what each one of us thinks, if there's something to add there with that, add there. 2, the overall more overarching physical benefits and benefits to understanding historic European martial arts. And 3, and Dillon, I'm looking at you as I'd like to hear some of yours on this one. I got a few. Let's look at some real specifics of like stuff you think that when someone wrestles that they are more likely to have and are able to get way more rapidly in terms of specificity. All right, so like leading with the psychological one, the psychological characterologic overall piece. there's two pieces I would like to throw in there. One touching on what Mike and Dillon were just talking about. Wrestling teaches you to lose, right? You know, you're going to get your ass kicked. And that's really important because that teaches you that learning is getting your ass kicked. And it's very direct. It's really hard to walk away from a wrestling match that you lost saying that, oh, well, I could have kicked his ass, or I did great, or, oh, well, you know what, that was just a double or whatever. You know what it feels like, and you get used to admitting it. And that is a very important lesson there. There's a lesson from before that, and we'll probably come back to this when we hit the how to teach bit and what's going on with it. The other thing wrestling and wrestling does is it breaks down people's inhibition around body contact, right? It gets you comfortable touching other people in really visceral ways that are often not understood in this society and not taught. And people in modern Western, particularly North American society, close touch is not something people are not used to if they have not done a grappling art or close-in dancing. Dancers are good for that too. If they've done partner acrobatic stuff, you'll get a few classes of physical activity. But it is often a route into teaching that and getting that level of comfort, which is necessary for any combat sport. And I think that's one of those things you get real fast, up close and personal from wrestling practices. Continue, if whoever wants to go next on this one, please do, but I just wanted to throw it in there.
On that note, one of the things that differentiates wrestling from striking arts is that wrestling, you can get your ass kicked in slow motion. If you get punched in the face and it takes you out, you go, oh, it was a fluke. It happened fast, you can rationalize it away. If you are ground out and held down for several minutes, you have a lot of time to build up your rationalization and have them crush through it and force you to process that reality. And I think that extra time to think about things can be really intellectually beneficial for people. I think even a judo match with an ippon where it's one big throw and it's over fast enough, people can rationalize away that split second a lot easier than they can rationalize away 2 minutes of being dominated on the mat.
You are very right. There's a old boxer I used to train with. I've heard him get into this conversation with some grapplers a few times, and his point was always, if you're going to knock someone out, make sure you land a couple real hard ones to the floating ribs and break them first. That way, when they wake up, they'll remember it for a few months and have that same learning effect. Yes. Other stuff in terms of benefits, and I think also the timing piece is interesting there, in that you learn time. I think that's something you touched on there, Stewart, that's really important. Timing is really hard for people to learn. It's incredibly hard, and one of the great subtleties of any striking art. The nice thing about grappling is you're usually working in much, much slower time frames. So it's easier for people, I think, to understand that timing matters, and then to move on to smaller pieces of time too. I think there's a piece of that there.
Yeah, I think it generally, at least once your wrestling is attached, guys who are really explosive young guys and shoot from the outside, or explosive judo entries, they can happen very fast. But once you tie up with somebody or you go to the mat with somebody, it's a slower process in general. And again, because it's kind of happening in slow motion, it allows you to break down those gradations, and you can feel different paces and the timing of technique, but also the time of your opponent. And you get practice reading an opponent that way. So this is kind of bleeding into your second point about the benefit to HEMA, but a lot of that German Fühlen concept, that sensitivity in the bind, that's all you're doing in wrestling. Bind work is a wrestling match between two swords. And so somebody picking that up at the speed of a fencing match is really hard. But somebody learning that tactile sensitivity, that feel of give and take and hard and soft, wrestling another human body, you get that tactile sensation very clearly and at a pace that's a little more manageable for learning.
I think that's both of that. That's absolutely spot on with that. one of the things that shocked, even knowing this going in and even having grappled for quite a while going in, playing with the BJJ crew for the last several months prior to pandemic, it's the first place that I saw highly technical work done in a complicated way with sophisticated setups that was operating at a speed where you could play that way out of the gate. It didn't take decades to get up to the point where like you might do some of that binding in HEMA or from a bridge in the standing stuff or trapping range, like you can get there, but just the fact that the baseline assumption in the wrestling stuff was to be able to have that kind of technical back and forth was astounding. That and as both of you, both Andrew and Stewart mentioned, I've heard it described as the pleasure of drowning. And that's something I haven't seen somewhere else. That I think builds into some of the most important psychological benefits.
That actually gets, does anyone have other stuff on other things they want to talk about psychological before we start going into more general?
Yeah, just really quick. And it's sort of related to the feeling thing and getting the, and the time is bit as well. Patience, I think, is a lot more of a factor in the wrestling situation as opposed to just feeling something out at a distance and trying to figure out the timing. Once you're entangled, sometimes that surviving and waiting, I think, helps a little bit. And that patience and being able to put up with the pressure until the opportunity happens, I think is a very useful journey. And then that happens over and over and over again.
Due to that, I've tapped out of confusion because I was being weighted out by some BJJ brown belts. I was at a spot where I'm like, I don't have any more puzzle pieces. I don't know what they're doing or where I'm going. And it was exactly that. Everything I did, they just waded through and just kept transitioning out of. I'm like, I've lost.
So my last thought about the psychological stuff is I'm thinking about the people in our audience or out there in the world who are listening to our conversation. And, you know, I don't know if you realize it, but we're talking about intensity and like holding on and squeezing people and what it feels like to have somebody laying on you. And I know I had students that would back off of this. They would face that immediately. They would feel this quickening in their chest, like, holy crap, I don't really want to do that. And that is that point where you feel that is where it begins. Is you're looking at something that is making you that scared, and if you just take a baby step and walk into it a little bit, that's how you can grow in that way, how you can face that fear and have it diminish over time. So, yeah.
Let's put it, I want to say, Mike, please let's put a pin on that and let's start the section of how to train with talking about getting through that. Okay, because I think that's the next logical place to go from here, because that's the first thing to get through. But please, folks, continue. I just wanted to say that's a really, really good point, and I think that's where we should start. Where we should start our how to train bit. Other stuff on psychology, anyone?
Exactly to what Mike was just saying. You can't build character except by being in situations that require it in a slightly greater degree than you already have. That's my that's not based on science. That's my personal opinion and just observation. And I think that's exactly the edge Mike is talking about there. Is like the dial lets you calibrate how to get to the spot that requires courage or perseverance, like Jude was saying, patience, or that understanding that you're going to lose, like all of those sorts of things, and being able to face that all with with some fortitude. That's exactly where that's the real stuff that in the end that's maybe the biggest thing anybody can get out of training. And having a dial that lets you hit it at just that spot and hold it there for as long as you need, but be able to back it off when you genuinely can't anymore. It makes the whole thing, that's more valuable, I think, than anything else you can get out of it.
Unless anyone's have anything else, moving into the more general physical qualities that one derives from this, that are more, that are somewhat more tangible, but not specific, not necessarily specific adaptations. You know, I think the bridge concept I would throw in there is, if you grapple, you learn to relax. You know, and not relax and you know, especially again, if you want to see if you want to go take a look at where the idea of relaxation goes horribly awry, just type Taiji into YouTube, push hands or Taiji, and watch 100 videos from 100 different sources. You will find at least 50 where you go, oh my God, that went really poorly. And that's not necessarily the skill. The skill that they're talking about is not the skill they're trying to train. That is because they've not had to relax under those circumstances. There's, you know, there are very few places where you really kind of learn that, like, struggling with all of your might and applying it is really just a way to wind up sucking wind and wind up crushed by increased pressure. And I think that gives you some lessons about relaxation, like whether it's with a strike with a sword, or whether it is with a jab, or whatever it is, that are very visceral and acquired very quickly. And I think that's one place in terms of one generalized adaptation that's sort of worth talking about. Other ones in terms of like physical adaptations and things you get. You know, the armor piece Mike was talking about a great deal, as was Dillon. Other things think people think that should be mentioned. Anyone?
Yeah, there's a balance. Your standing base becomes so much better, I think, just beside wrestling. Because you're used to people trying to not just hit you, but trying to knock you down all the time, right? So your standing, moving base becomes a lot more, I don't want to say solid, stable, I guess would be the right term, right? Because it's relaxed, it's still mobile, but you're sort of a teeter-totter-ish, right? It's hard to knock you over. So I think that's one.
Along the same lines, strong line, weak line in structure. Yeah, it's amazing that when you're touching somebody and wrestling with them, that those lines, those biomechanical lines where someone's stable, you push them one way and they're stable, push them another way and they're not, that they're the same lines that exist when you're sword fighting. Like they're really, there's some differences that has to do with where the energy's going, but generally speaking, it's the same concept of capturing the center with swords versus taking over someone's, obtaining control when you're clinching in a tie. So becoming very intuitive about what's a guy's strong line and where is he weak, is inherent in wrestling. That's what it is. You're finding their weak line.
That, and I feel really stupid for not having made this connection explicitly before, but that ties exactly into what Stewart was saying with taking the time frame and exploding it outward, where you'll spend minutes in contact with somebody's strong and weak lines in their base and how that's all coordinating at a time in wrestling. And if you have that contact in a sword fight or in a striking match, it's for the briefest section of a second. It's like just the sheer amount of data you get from being in contact over time for taking that instant of contact. You can get away with a lot worse angulation and structure and all that for a lot longer in a striking system or in a sword system than you can in a wrestling. The feedback's immediate and persistent.
If they're good.
Right, if they're not good, it's a real short. Yeah.
Other stuff for general qualities before we go on to like any very serious specifics. Any last call for general stuff?
How long has it been since somebody said it builds character?
I think it's been 5 minutes. Can we just put that on record?
Always throw that in every 5 minutes.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's time.
Yeah. It's about time. We're not going to mention oil checking as a technique, but
No.
That's in the training section at the end. No.
Did you say no?
General stuff, and for specifics, one I would lead off with, if you've wrestled, you've gotten used to getting snapped down, and you've started to learn how not to be snapped down. Snap down, for folks who don't know what that means, is someone grabbing you by the head and ripping it down. It's really effective. If you train to deal with that necktie a fair bit, it becomes something that's very hard to do to you. It is the one basic thing that people, when they decide to grab you, will tend to do, whether it is the dumbass headlock or whether it is a more sophisticated, like a plum out of Muay Thai or just a single collar tie. But, getting your neck stronger, getting your neck stronger makes that less likely as a combat thing. Also, there's a strong correlation between neck extensor strength and athletic performance when you look at everything. And and it reduces your concussion risk. And you know what? Learning ways to do those things, or getting those attributes, will serve you well in any circumstance.
I don't want to step too much into the how to train section, but yeah, one of the first and most essential things you'll learn is that somebody's going to try and snap your head down. How do you defend against that? And it builds really beneficial athletic attributes, like you said. But it's not just a matter of having the strongest neck. There's technique to it, and there's posture to it. And the posture that defends you against a snap down teaches good postural habits that will tie into all those general things we were talking about balance and mobility and understanding your strong line and your weak line. And so much of how we orient our bodies comes from how we orient our heads. So starting with that starts people on a good road for their overall posture, which will translate effectively to any kind of fighting they do.
Yeah, both in terms of like you were saying, Stewart, actually conditioning or getting hypertrophy, like bigger muscles with that. It's also the same kinesthetic or fascial chain that is dealt for any hinging movement. So jumping, running, sprinting, hitting, all of those are even though the point of contact's at the head, it's the same set of muscular connections that's responsible for basically every athletic movement. And like Andrew touched on, one of the biggest things, just for sheer longevity, concussion resistance is about as good as it gets. And that's probably the top correlation, neck strength to concussion resistance. Like you obviously need helmets for all kinds of reasons, but you find it interesting, like looking at any collision stuff, helmets are really, really useful once the amount of force delivered is enough to crack a skull. Once you can like break somebody's head open with the crash, or say with a sword, helmets get really useful. Helmets are really bad at concussion prevention for anything below that mark because they increase the axis of rotation. They actually make your axions take more force in rotation. The equivalent, like maybe your single best concussion prevention tool over your gear the majority of the time is having a strong neck. And to Stewart's point, strength is a skill. So it's not just having a strong neck like big neck muscles, that's a huge part of it, but also knowing how to tie that back into the rest of your body. So when somebody hits you, they hit all of you. They don't just hit one part and send that part spinning off into orbit.
Yep.
So heads, it's also, there's three centers, right? There's the center of your pelvis, the center of your shoulders, and then your head. And so like people talk about learning about the center. And again, it's one of those things that you can kind of learn it, and it is you can feel good about some stuff you can do with it when you start getting an understanding of it. But in wrestling, there's a very pragmatic reasons for understanding what the center is, what it means, and how you use it. The lower center is how you stifle. If you can control that, you'll stifle somebody's mobility. The shoulder girdle, if you can control that, you stifle their ability to do something to you. And then the head, you stifle their ability to process, to think. So you learn how to use that. Those three things.
Before we move on, if anyone has any more general stuff, please, any more specific general stuff, please move on. To wrap this up, does anyone? Anything? To conclude this, I think there's something that would be an interesting exercise if anyone has anything else to chime in on. You know, the idea, Dillon and Mike were talking about the idea of a passing step being taught by a shot. And I think that's actually a really interesting concept. And here's what I would throw out. Beyond anything else, what do you think that learning wrestling does to make your diagonal forehand, Zornhau, Zornhau, Fendente, whatever you want to call it, that shot, what do you think you get out of it by wrestling? And again, that explosive passing step with a shot is the example that made me think of that. Are there things people would throw in for other things you think that are a benefit you get from that?
The most obvious one to me, aside from that gut willingness to go in, so that's part of the psychological, and the ability to drive forward hard through the hips, is that you're really used to making contact, moving in a coordinated and sequential fashion and making contact as a unit. So like I said, the contact on the sword, the contact on the hand, the contact everywhere in the wrestling shot is going to be the entire body. And it's going to be the body used to going in around obstacles and continuing to pressure forward, to change course, change the pitch and yaw and height and all of that sort of part of a course while keeping the straightforward momentum. And like I said, doing that all as one thing. That seems, I've less time with that particular than everybody. So I'm psyched to hear what everyone else has to say, but that seems obvious to me, that part of it.
Yeah. My take would be, and I see that with my own folks, is Stewart probably won't like this, but my main folks, a lot of my competition team on the HEMA side actually comes out of my MMA gym, only because they saw the swords and go, whoa, that's cool, I want to do that too, right? None of them want to wrestle, because they wrestle all the time, right? So none of them want to wrestle when they fence. That being said, they never wind up in positions where they have to wrestle. So no one grabs their swords, no one ties them up. It just doesn't happen because they're used to the ranges and they stay where they want to play, right? So and then that sort of plays back into, say, MMA in the early 2000s, right? There was a phase where it was going back and forth between people that were strikers and grapplers, right? And then all of a sudden, BJ Penn and one of the Diaz guys started coming up, and some others where they were grapplers that were striking. And one of the main reasons was they weren't scared of getting taken down, right? Yeah. So you don't have that fear or whatever. It's a comfortable space so you can play at that other distance. So I think that's a useful thing as well.
Being really good at wrestling is the best way I know to not have to wrestle with people. As somebody who prefers hitting people to wrestling. Sort of.
With regard to your idea of the Zornhau and the passing step, so one of the things that I think a shoot is similar to the passing step, and Dillon was talking about this, is when you are going in, you have to drive in over the leg that is connected to the ground. So you have to project your center of gravity forward, and in the case of a takedown, you've got to go down at the same time. So as you go in, ideally you're connected with your back foot, and your front foot isn't. It's hitting the ground, but at the moment of impact, you're not. It's not where you're connected, and then when you turn the corner to go side to turn the angle on the guy, you'll change where you're connected to the ground and move in. And that movement in of the takedown is what a passing step ought to be when you're attacking. where you're connected to your back leg and not your front leg when you go in. So there's a timing thing there. So that's a specific benefit of a takedown feeling, I think. And I'm not sure if that's where you're aiming with this, but yeah.
I'm just, in a very concrete way, it's what is wrestling? How does wrestling make your most basic sword hit better?
Yeah.
Similarly, like you were saying, like timing within the movement, like you were saying, Mike, and also that timing for when you hit that threshold, like what is the point where you can hit your shot? When are you too far away? When are you too close? Like there's so many little things like that. Timing between you and the partner as well as within your own steps.
Here's one I would throw in. Kinesthetic awareness of the scapulothoracic junction and upper back development. One of the prime motor controllers for any striking, but really for two-handed weapons, is upper back. And every time you start working someone, both on longsword or longer weapons, that, when they start to figure out how to move it there with their body, that gets lit up. That piece, when you wrestle, you can't not have that. And it actually winds up teaching people how to use this bit real well. And that, most people, when they come to you as trainees, do not even really sort of understand that their shoulder joint and their shoulder girdle are two different things. You may find these glued down. Jude, we were talking about this with Elric on that call a little while ago. But it's, that's, again, highly specific things. There's some very real body changes and bits of kinesthetic awareness and connector that you get out of this. That, it's a quick route too. And like, it can take a little bit if you're teaching someone to strike with a weapon, both to understand that physically and be able to do it, and to have the musculature to be able to do it.
Eric, if you're managing this, if you'll remind me after, I'll put on the Facebook thing a quote from Sword in the Stone, the old T.H. White book that talks about specifically that with swords and movement and how to generate power and all that.
You got it.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Everyone okay? Moving on to how to train. So now we're at the guts of it. How to train wrestling. Okay. Callie had asked the question, earlier on, how does one train this stuff safely? And I would add, especially for beginners and without people, for beginners and for people who really don't have prior experience. I would say I would add in for variable fitness and age levels. What's the best way to do that? And I would then and the place I would like to start that conversation before we start getting into how to do a drill would be with Mike talking with Mike and talking about how do you get someone psychologically able to go wrestle rather than having to, and make it easier to get into that and get them to cross that threshold so they don't go, I ain't gonna do it. I'm not coming to class tonight. And the only way you get to have wrestling practices, the only way you can make sure your attendance is good is that you just don't tell them that you're wrestling that night and stick them with it, which, is one way of doing things.
Yeah. Well, so when I teach beginning longsword, I actually introduce people to wrestling right along with it. And the way that I do that is I first make it clear that it's part of it. Most people that come in to us don't think about wrestling as a thing when they come. They're interested in the longsword. So I'm gentle, right? You don't want to throw people into stuff they can't do. What you want to do as a teacher is to be astute enough to kind of sense where people's limits are and give them something that they can do that they a little bit don't think they can do. And then watch them grow, and when they're ready, do it again. And so the first thing I start out with wrestling is movement programming, what I call movement programming, which is to get people to start moving in a wrestling-like way. So we do a sit-out drill and giant strides as an exercise in part of our warm-ups, like 3, 4, 5, until by the end of the 8 weeks, we're doing set at 20. And I leave it at that. So the first dilemma here is this conundrum of people aren't physically ready to do wrestling. How do you get them to do it? And for me, one way of doing that is to program the movement that you're going to rely on later into their bodies to begin with. And that builds up their strength and their capacities. And the second thing that we do right off is standing ties. We start off with just a practice with, somebody grabs you by the hand. And, it's interesting. You grab somebody by the wrist and pretty soon somebody grabs them by the elbow. It kind of progresses until they're like actually wanting to throw each other on the ground. And you make it kind of fun, and they don't really know what they're doing until I talk about it. So anyway, I know that you guys have lots of good ideas, so I guess my broad answer, Andrew, is that you got to be sensitive to the people that you're teaching and work from there. Yeah.
Can I jump in?
Please.
So I like what Mike was saying about integrating wrestling-based movements into the warm-up for a sword-centered class. And that is an advantage that HEMA has that if you're just teaching an unarmed martial art, you don't necessarily have in the same way. So your question of how do you get someone who's older, who's not physically fit, to be able to wrestle, part of the question is what context is the training happening in? Because if they say, I just want to come in to learn to wrestle, and you say, okay, we're going to do 2 months of movement drills before you get to do any sort of resistant training with a partner, very few people are going to enjoy that process and find that intellectually engaging. They're going to get bored and disinterested. But if you can sprinkle that in as part of your warm-up practice, and then the reward is now you get to do sword drills, and aren't swords exciting, that allows you to ease people into wrestling in a more gentle way than if the whole class was centered on wrestling. The other things that can be really off-putting for people, the physical proximity thing and the intensity of wrestling can be intimidating to some people. And other people think, oh, that's wimpy compared to hitting people. And there are opposite solutions to those. I think people who don't think wrestling looks cool enough, you kind of have to dial up the cool on your demo. When you demonstrate the technique, you got to make that takedown look good. And then they'll go, oh, okay, I want to learn how to do that. But if you talk up how awesome and, what was your coach's phrase, Mike, crush their spirit. If you talk that up too much to the shyer, more nervous students, that can be really intimidating. So me, I teach preschool. I work with little kids all the time. So I have no problem giving goofy, self-deprecating speeches. So I will try and make the technical demo look really cool. And I will say, and now class, we get to play a game. I don't say, and now we're going to drill hard and practice crushing each other into the mat. I'm going to say, we're playing a game. It's a really simple game. It's like tag. In tag, one person tries to tag, the other person tries to run away. This is like that, except one person's going to try and make the other person fall down. And phrasing stuff in the sense of game helps take out the urgency, the anxiety for people who are intimidated by it. And it helps people play playfully. It helps them drill. I've met instructors who will just say, do the technique 5 times on each side, and now we're going to spar. And the other person lays there like a dead fish while you practice your technique. And that's not as efficient a way to train once you actually vaguely understand the technique. You need it to be playful. You need that variability to it, and everybody's going to get more out of that. So a lot of my coaching is, how do I teach this lesson in the format of a game? And that's at once more efficient learning and less intimidating to students who are feeling anxious about the new activity.
Yeah, to bookend that, Stewart and I come from basically the same background on the grappling side. So if you hear us lapsing into Portland grappling speak, please someone in the chat let us know if we're saying stuff that doesn't make sense. Anyway, yeah, the game thing's ultra important, and then realizing levels of discomfort for folks. And I guess just to frame how we're going to go forward a little bit, I guess building around that discomfort may be a good way to do it. The two biggest places would be, as everyone's been saying here, that closeness that people have. That's one thing that you need to overcome, right? Or overcoming the discomfort at that closeness. And the second thing is fear of falling down. Those are like the two biggest fears that I think people have, and making games about it. So having, like Mike could probably say, and Stewart said this earlier, if you're really bouncy and you're starting to wrestle at 4, you don't really learn to fall. You just sort of fall and get back up over and over again. And as your bones start getting harder, you sort of figure out some ways work better than others. And then you just sort of do it, right? There really isn't that much of a formal way of learning how to fall for people that start wrestling at a very young age. For people that start later, judo background or things, that's a very nice codified way of learning how to do it. And that's readily accessible on YouTube and so on. One thing I'd add to that, because everybody else goes to judo also on the Chinese side, the Shuijiao stuff has an interesting take on falling. I was fortunate enough to train with some of those folks for a little bit. All they do is they curl up and pick a direction in which to fall. So they sort of semi-fetal position, make sure they pull everything in, and then they'll either straight back, side, side. That's it. But they're still practicing falling, but they're not as systematized in the Japanese stuff. So for some people, that might even work better, right? And it's accomplishing the same things. You pull the important stuff out so it doesn't land on the ground, right? So you're pulling your legs in, or you're spraying them out so they don't land on top of each other. You're not setting so you post on a limb, so like pushing your hand down this way so you get a nice spiral fracture, right? So a lot of the Japanese stuff, you'd be extending your arm so it flattens out and you'll take it more on the meat of your arm, right? And for the Chinese stuff, you're just sort of landing with more meat connected to the ground. So both of those systems work pretty well. And they've been doing it a while, right? Under resistance, right? And for the close thing, I guess the best way to do that, at least for my experience, is, as Stewart was saying, games. And the simplest ones are two things you're going to be doing. Is you're going to be pushing somebody, you're going to be pulling them, and you're going to be trying to hug them or snap them down, right? So snap down's really important in the modern sense, because if people wrestle, it's immediately transferable to the modern context, right? But in the historical context, because of clothes or culture and things like that, it's not as common to have a collar tie or a high lapel tie historically, right? So you need to scale that a little bit depending on what your goals are in the school, right? So just having a game where you have someone stand in a decent posture and you're just pushing each other back and forth, taking turns, then you can make that competitive, right? That's another way. Then you can make a bumper car drill, like a bunch of people in a small area just sort of bouncing off each other, and that's sort of fun. And then if you're practicing falling, you just have somebody bump somebody and then they fall. So no real throws, right? They're just getting comfortable falling and then they're taking turns doing that. And then that's one way to do it. And then have someone try to hug the person and then the person just trying to stay as tight as possible, and then try and go back and forth doing that. So that's one way to safely go back and forth to develop that. Anything else on that, Stuart?
Well, with learning how to fall and talking about how you introduce it to the group varying by the group's objectives and also by the group's skill level, think about what wrestling is important to your group. Are you looking at trying to build skill for self-defense, build skill specifically for modern longsword tournament, or trying to emulate what's historically in the manuals? But there are some falls that are bigger than others. And if you have a coach in your group who knows the difference, or you can ask somebody, they can tell you, standard single leg takedown is a really good, reliable takedown. It's not a big drop. A jacketed uchimata can be a much bigger throw. Jacketed throws tend to be bigger in general because you're holding somebody at arm's length instead of holding them to your body. So the circumference of the arc of their spine through the air is bigger. So knowing those things, and you can start with the littler takedowns as your group is getting more comfortable with these things. Ease into that way. But also, pretty much all the takedowns are going to be predicated on getting grips, getting control, getting the posture of your opponent broken. So you can emphasize those things if you have a group that isn't ready to get to the falling stage yet, either for skill reasons or fitness reasons, that you need more time to ease into that. The nice thing, not every group has this. I've trained on plenty of asphalt as a fencer, but one thing the modern world has that medieval Europe didn't is foam rubber mats, and those are amazing. Those are a wonderful thing if you have access to them. And they're so much more forgiving than the ground that occurs out there in the world.
So we were trying to answer Callie's question about how to start training this stuff safely. We're starting to touch on different, we're talking a little bit about how to get people comfortable, and we're starting to touch on methods to do that. And I think everyone's, the things that have been said so far, incorporate drills in your warm-up, learn to fall early, and we were starting to get into games and drills you can learn to do that. Before we do, we go any further, I kind of want to back up for a half second and also and say something that the most dangerous person is the spaz. It's someone who's freaked out in whatever form that is. And, I want to give Kaya some credit. She's the one who really, I think, articulated this very, very well. Have the conversation about adrenaline before you're dealing with a crying mess or someone who's just punched someone out. And actually, that's probably the best piece of safety equipment is a safe training partner. So getting everyone comfortable and making sure that they're not freaking out when the thing occurs is what prevents weird freaked out accidents from happening. So managing people psychologically and understanding where people are at is probably one of your most important things for safety. As an idiot can make nearly anything dangerous, a scared idiot is even better at it. And that fear can come out a bunch of ways. With that, again, I've coached a bunch of people with PTSD in various forms for various reasons. Sometimes they have a bunch of touch issues. Ask people before you touch them. Ask permission a lot. And then if you have someone who has particular issues, you may need to push on them, touch them, do things that are less intense just to get them used to being touched, that are part of the thing before they even start doing anything that's vaguely like a game of resistance, because just letting someone into that space is a massive barrier to overcome for them. Sorry, wouldn't want to walk on that, but please go on with let's start going into drills and stuff we can do. Dillon, please go. Yes, also. But, yeah.
That was actually, I had just two safety comments on that. That was the first one of them, brilliantly, very well. You covered the bases. One of the things that's weird, if you haven't done wrestling stuff in particular, that can be unexpected is, as Mike had mentioned earlier, it's a relatively primal. So you'll wind up with emotional responses to proxemics to wrestling that you will not have with weapons work. And you will have to a much lesser degree with empty hand work. One of the weird spots you'll see the difference is if you transition from like reasonable contact with empty hand work with gloves is dramatically less emotional than reasonable contact with empty hand work bare knuckle. It triggers stuff in an entirely different way, and the wrestling stuff tends to step that up a notch. So that's something you absolutely have to be prepared for, that people are going to be in their rational mind totally fine and will panic in the weirdest times. And it's one of the things that is easy to forget if you've been wrestling or coaching or throwing for a long time. The amount somebody will freak out during a completely controlled, not painful, not even uncomfortable takedown is remarkably high. And that's something that just to be aware of and watch out for. One thing that I will say on the general safety stuff that sort of ties together a few of the other points is if there's somebody in your area who has expertise in grappling work, could be a high school wrestling coach, could be a judo club, could be whatever, it would really behoove people who don't have that background to have them on a retainer, pull them into the club, team up somehow, because some of this stuff on the throws that are dangerous versus not isn't necessarily immediately apparent. I thought of this with Stewart's Uchimata comment. Done well and appropriately, things like a haragosh, like a sweeping hip throw where you reap the leg, are very, very safe and can actually be done gently, much more so than like the freak out factor is more likely a safety issue than any actual injury, unless the person you're playing with puts all their weight on that leg and locks the knee and you hit them at the knee with the reap. And that's not, so 95% of the time, there's no consequence to doing the throw. Even if you screw it up, usually you just both do a front roll together. But it's good to have somebody on hand or work with somebody who has some experience in knowing what are the ways this throw goes wrong, or what are the ways this throw does not, like what are the throws that are, so very specifically to stuff you see in HEMA, some of the upper locking throws in Fiore, like where you'll wind up with basically a high whizzer and a takedown. Those are things where if you pull their hand into their shoulder, you can go fast and hard with people who don't know how to fall and put them down very safely. And as soon as the hand starts coming away from the shoulder, the torque on the arm goes up massively and the odds of blowing somebody's elbow or shoulder out get really, really high. And those are things that won't necessarily, so it's a throw that is both, it's something I've used on involuntary subjects who had no idea what to do on asphalt safely. And it's stuff that you could very easily mess up your friends if you do it to them hard at the wrong angle. So having somebody to consult, in these times through video, whatever, but tapping into a resource on that to give it an idea, like give a structure, be like, hey, with this thing, you got to watch out for this. Or here's a list of 5 takedown techniques that are fairly, are high percentage and low injury risk. Like having that sort of on-hand consulting one way or the other is really useful if you have no background, if you have nobody there who knows how to it was sort of like with translating manuscripts for swordplay, having somebody who's got their eyes in on the grappling stuff in general to take a look at the manuscripts and be like, yeah, this is one anybody could do day one and they're not going to spaz and goof up and hurt someone. Like I think the single's a pretty safe way. Like that's a really solid, safe technique for that sort of thing as an example. And same for a lot of the reaping throws. It's really uncommon to actually hurt somebody with a foot sweep unless you're kicking the leg hard, unless you mistake.
I will also say some of the illustrations in the manual show grapevining the legs, which is a great way to have somebody who doesn't really understand how to do the takedown tangle themselves up with another person, and then they fall over and they hurt their own knee.
Yeah, there's...
So, for anyone out there, if you're not sure 100% what you're doing, do not grapevine and twist and tangle your leg around somebody else's leg.
Yeah,
This directly answers a question Eric had put to us and wanted us to answer. Would you say it's possible for the thrower to do the throw perfectly safely and for the throwee to respond in a way that causes injury despite the thrower's best efforts? Fools are so ingenious.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
It depends on how strictly you define a perfectly safe throw. because I've seen a perfectly executed throw to land somebody flat on their back, where if the person doesn't get that they're being landed safely flat on their back, they can spaz and injure themselves.
Yeah.
Then I've seen the perfectly executed throw where you have to pause at the top and lower the person down. But throw is trickier than takedown. I think of a throw as something that has some airtime to it.
Yeah, it's a
There are definitely
subcategory.
takedowns where you can simply buckle somebody's posture, where the shoulders are no longer
Yeah,
over the hips are no longer over the heels, and you just drop them in a hole. And there are some of those that you can do pretty much foolproof. Just set a person down on the ground.
Yeah, and to go on for that about training safely, right? It doesn't have to be all put together, right? You can train the falling bit separately from the entering and unbalancing bit. You can train those separately. They don't necessarily have to go together. And then if you're going to prioritize putting somebody on the ground, prioritizing good structure and putting the person in an unbalanced position, you can practice that really well for a long time, and you will accidentally come up with good throws. That's what's going to happen, right? If you train that in a nice alive situation, you'll have a set of takedowns just because you're practicing unbalancing somebody all the time, right? So you can practice that. And then I would, like Dillon was saying, if you don't have access to people that can give you perspective on how throws work, right? Or what's more risky than others, prioritizing takedowns. So like takedowns being something that doesn't lift the person up and they don't flip over. They just sort of, I call them crumples is basically what I call them. I get to a good tie-up position, like Mike was saying, then I just put them in a bad line, and then I put force in that bad line and move my body in a certain way. They just sort of fall down. Those are the kinds I like at my age, and it fits my game.
I'm younger than you, Jude, but I think I'm lazier, so I like those too.
There you
So
go.
I have, there's two thoughts I had. One was about the earlier topic, but regarding this one, so in wrestling, rather than teaching, you alluded to this, Jude, earlier, rather than teaching about a break fall, what the admonition to everyone was, to all the kids when I was coaching, was that you're responsible for the safe return of your opponent to the mat. So that was a rule. So in fact, if you picked a guy up and you slammed them in high school, that you could get disqualified for that. So you had to figure out how to do these throws in a way that was safe. I think that's a good idea to begin with. And then at the same time, you teach break falls, and then the combination of those two allows you to start making transition into fighting and throwing people in armor, because it's a different situation when somebody, or with a sword in their hands. It's different when they have a sword in their hand. If you throw them in a way that is uncontrolled, expecting them to break fall, sometimes the sword gets in the way. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the idea of taking care of people when they come in. My experience is that almost no one comes into practice without personal stuff to work on. And some of that stuff gets manifested in being quite, without being deprecating, fearful. The other manifestation of that is anger or being a dick. And so when you see somebody, as a teacher, somebody comes in and they're kind of hot, they're running hot, and they want to do stuff that's, it feels like they're being real serious. A lot of times they're actually scared, and they're masking that in a way that they're used to. So they are not to be chastised unless they're truly being wieners. You have to figure that out, and a lot of times if you talk to guys, people that are doing that, what you'll find is that they're literally going like this. Or we've had situations where somebody's been kind of aggressive, and then put them with somebody who is more senior to them, and then did the thing that Dillon said, held them down. And what almost always happens is a bit of an emotional release, and it's an opportunity, if you're that kind of a teacher, to help them out a little bit, to allow that to happen and work through it with them. Take some skill in that regard to do that.
That relates back to what Andrew was saying about there being nothing more dangerous than a spaz. And one of the challenges that, if people are watching this and thinking about how to start up a wrestling program in a group that doesn't have wrestlers, they won't have that opportunity to pair the spazzy new guy with a more senior person. But that's often, they'll say, white belts sparring is the most dangerous sparring. You don't want a white belt sparring with another white belt, a beginner sparring with another beginner. So you'll put them with somebody more experienced who could beat them up but won't, because they're being nice. And then you get the guy who's angry or scared and acting angry. And if they're bullying other people, then you have a couple of different ways of dealing with that. And the most common is you put them with somebody enough better than them that they can just hold them down until they can process those realizations. The danger is when you have the person who's acting angry and the other person with them is inexperienced enough that their ego gets engaged too. And they feel like they have something to prove because this person is going so hard. I was just joking earlier about the takedowns and saying how lazy I am. One of the things I've found is the people who are really worked up and wanting to brawl when it's supposed to be learning time, I'll pull them over to spar with me. And I used to do that thing when I was younger. I'd hold the guy down and let him exhaust himself with his emotionality and then talk about it when he calmed down. I was like, oh, that's too much work, holding down an angry, spazzy person. I'll let him come at me and I'll just sort of matador around, and I won't fight back, but I won't get squished either. And I'll let him not feel attacked. I'll let him feel like, you can come at me. You can come at me, and especially on the ground where we're not really moving much. But let him get it out of his system without getting any product out of it, but without adding to his fear by squishing him. And some people, their ego needs that squish, and some people it slows down the learning process. And you kind of get a read on that as you get to know the person. But that's one of the advantages you have in a school or a group where there are skill levels. In an established group where there's a depth of ability and understanding.
This
stuff is harder when you're all beginners. And when you're all beginners, you just have to take it slower and more conscientiously.
This conversation is actually getting back at the idea that character matters.
Yeah. It's 5 minutes of time, right?
Yeah, we're way over 5 minutes.
Yeah, damn. Should have set an alarm. To recap again for Callie. So, the first thing is setting the stage. So setting the stage and knowing who you're dealing with and trying to make sure it's a safe space and managing people's reactions. Moving forward, the next thing that everyone seems to have consensus on is practice falling, right? And do that and integrate wrestling drills to get covered. And then the next one is integrate wrestling drills into your warm-up and into your regular practice. So it's something that is leavened in and is regularly done so that it becomes natural to them and they become comfortable with motion in those places. The next piece that we then started talking about was, high amplitude throws are not for beginners and, require management. And you should probably work on grinding takedowns at first that are really work really well on people who have not great base. So they're really rewarding that way, and it's significantly safer.
Or just obtain control.
Yeah, all bunch of good stuff there. We were getting into games and like ways to learn wrestling and ways to train. Let's talk a little bit, keeping going. We were talking about push and pull, and I know everyone here has games and everyone here has ways of doing this. Let's talk a little bit about how to manage the beginner and the intermediate, and then, like other stuff that you think is important in training or more advanced concepts next, if that would be. I think, is everyone good with that? We're closing in on 9. We can go over if we want, and if there are any questions from the crowd, please throw them in now. But like, let's start. Let's move into a little like, all right, how do you get people moving? How do you get a beginners group going? How do you get an intermediate going? What does it look like? What sort of stuff do you like doing with people? Dillon.
Super right out of the gate, like day one stuff for everybody, and tying in with that, integrating into the warm-up things. Even if you never transitioned into wrestling and for whatever reason you want to stay a bad and terrible person, any of the gymnastics animal crawls, any rolling drills, those will have a huge benefit. Like, again, back just even proprioceptively. That's the sort of stuff that integrating into your warm-ups can fix people's chronic injuries. And they're a really good way to get the heart rate up and all that sort of thing without any real risk of injury. So out of the gate, animal crawls, rolling drills. I really like, and this is when you have to watch out for with people who've got structural issues with their knees. The Japanese Shiko knee walking, you'll see Aikido demonstrates beautifully. Yeah, I was going to say, that's going to make HEMA's weird. It actually skews way older than most martial arts do for beginning students, observationally. If you have people who can do that, that's really incredible for getting hip drive. So that's something good to put into the younger groups. You're going to find a lot of your, I would say even late 20s and up students are going to have trouble starting off with that. And I'm getting a look here. So, but that's where I would start, is find appropriate for the level of athleticism and level of pre-existing injury for your class, groundwork, ground skills, working get-ups, any of that sort of stuff out of the gate, and just start filtering that in. If you never made it past that, it'd be a huge benefit.
For those older guys, standing, grappling, and clinching, and learning to take control, like the arm drag. Arm drag's an amazing thing to do. It's just like, if you figure that out in a variety of ways, then you'll always be on top of the guy because you're getting to their side. And any big old guys that don't have knees anymore, they can still do that. Mm-hmm. Teaching people how to not be susceptible to being thrown. Like that, I have a bunch of stuff related to that that has to do with actually push hands, mm-hmm. Tai Chi push hands. If you get good at that and then you wrestle with it, if you learn from Tai Chi guys and then say, okay, we're going to go into a wrestling match now, and now I'm going to try to do this to a guy that's a wrestler, you'll actually see that there's value in it. As a way of helping people see how to actually accommodate these things and or how to use them in practice. So I do that quite a bit with the older people that I work with. Are we losing folks here? Yeah. Anyway,
some people might have dropped off for a moment. What were you saying?
Back, no worries.
Stewart, you. Go ahead, Stewart. I'll go.
Okay. I have opinions. So, Jude, like you said, neckties and snap-downs are not something we see as often in the medieval German text or the Italian text. I think some different reasons, some cultural reasons, some postural reasons, and where grips were available on things. But I'm a huge believer in you build your posture and then you build your movement. You know how to stand, you know how to move, then you learn how to move the other person. And I think learning the efficient postures to push and pull somebody teaches you so much about your own base and posture and stance. And so I tend to start with the things that I think inform those good postural habits. So I start with head position drills where you learn keeping your eyes rolled up and level changing with bending your knees to lower the elevation of your hips, and how you can push somebody with your head. And Jude, I'm sure you've never done any drills like this. But no, I always start with head position and snap down, because if people learn, this is my standard speech for everybody out there on the internet. If you're standing on the balls of your feet, your abs are engaged, you're in basically good upright posture, and you turn your eyes are going to turn your neck. And you turn your neck, it's going to turn your whole spine, the shoulders, the hips. And if you're in the balls of your feet, it's going to turn your legs. And human beings are built to move in the direction their eyeballs point. If you want to throw somebody or push them around, look where you want them to go, and you'll move them more efficiently. So good posture like that, and you put not dignified speeches, silly speeches. You spike them with the unicorn horn right there on the neck. You can shove somebody around because you're simultaneously lining up good spinal posture for you and breaking their spinal posture and taking them off their strong line. So I start with games and drills about that. And then you add in the snap down. So if people are staring at their toes or bending at the waist to change their level, and you just push the back of their head, back of my head's very shiny. I apologize if I whited out the screens there. But it teaches that good posture, the head, the neck, how to level change. And then teach the swim drills for overhooks and underhooks. And it teaches how to turn your hips and shoulders as a unit, how to generate power that way. And if you understand those postural principles, you can play a lot of games and drills about pushing and pulling the other guy and make it a flow that is very simple. Andrew mentioned about moving from the basic to the advanced. I don't like the word advanced so much as complicated or high risk. There are big things that you want to wait on because they're challenging, and there are big things you want to wait on because if the other guy doesn't know how to fall properly, you can hurt him. But the basics are the tools you will use 90% of the time. They're the basics because they're the fundamentals and they're the most valuable. And if you've got a good head position game and a good swim game, your upright wrestling and your overall posture will be solid, and that will pay huge dividends.
In the interest of memorable coaching language, now that we're past the cutoff for children, my judo coach was also a catch wrestler and used to call that the fuck unicorn.
Nice.
I guess then on top of that, so I guess going off of that, so that's really the fundamental thing, right? Being able to keep that structure, keep that posture under pressure when someone's trying to break it, right? Someone else trying to break it, then trying to impose the structure you want onto the other person. That's really the whole game, right? And then everything else sort of goes off of that. So like if you play reductionist, right? Any of the systems will boil down to that kind of a dynamic, right? So if you're looking at a historical source and you're trying to evaluate the worth or whatever of it or how useful it is like, how well do they communicate that? Or would they, if they're like some people have said before, if they take it as a granted, right? It shows as well. And if not, it'll show in the plays as well, because there'll be some sort of root movement and things that grow off of that root movement, right? And then you can see that. So the next thing up from that would be what makes the actual takedowns or throws or limb destructions or whatever makes those work would be like what I would say would be an intermediate or the lower percentage stuff. And that's what you could play with, right? So you already have that structure, and then you can make a game where you're fighting for that position. That would go next in how I would perceive it, right? You could have a game where you're pushing and pulling each other, but then you're fighting for an arm drag, right? So everybody has an arm drag. So you have the arm and then you're on the other side. So every system has that. And then some will have that elbow press. Some will reverse it to that figure four thing. So you'll see that in multiple sources, but they sort of come off of that arm drag naturally, right? And you don't necessarily have to do the figure 4 all the time, but if you're trying to figure out how to get that arm drag all the time, that'll feed right into it. So I would say that would be the next bit. And then the exploration of the actual throws and so on, you could do a breakdown of that as well, right? So the best ones for you to practice the most times would be, in my opinion, the ones you could practice safely under the most resistance most often would be the ones I would prioritize. And then I would lower all the other ones, right? So the ones you can't practice as safely, the ones you can't really do under a whole lot of resistance, you know, they're the ones you'll pull out of your bag if you really need it, that kind of a thing. I would put lower on the list.
A thing to throw in there, just that struck me as important to mention. One of the things you see in a lot of manuscripts is small joint manipulation, which is incredibly low yield, empty-handed. What becomes interesting, and I think, you know, this is why it's in the manuscripts and why you see this in the Japanese jiu-jitsu traditions, is that when you have something you really don't want to let go of, a bunch of those small joint manipulations actually become like way more valid and doable and are way more likely. And those small joint manipulations are some of the most dangerous things out there to train, because when you get them right, it takes very little force for them to work. So that's one of those, like, if we're going to go in training safety and like do the safe stuff first, like if you're going to do that's like that you know, the small joint stuff, getting someone who actually knows how to do it is really absolutely vital. And then like being real careful when you sneak up on doing some of this stuff with, like, things will behave differently with a weapon in your hand in some ways than they will empty hand, because people will, you'll get some different dynamics in a limb. Dillon.
This is a really obvious bit on training safely, and it's sort of a meta issue. It's its own problem. It's a really obvious bit that's so obvious it gets forgotten to get mentioned because it's so intrinsic to the way everybody does it. Make sure with any of this, and I promise this ties in, that you go over your safety protocols with everybody every session. The reason I mention that is I have a 20-ish year old elbow tendinopathy issue from a kote hinari, a wrist twist from Aikido. Nikyo would be, or Nikajo, depending on if you know the Japanese system for it, which is because it goes from very little to explosively damaging really quickly. And the conversation surrounding it was, I said, ow. The person training me said, tap. I said, ow. The person said, tap. My wrist popped. And I said, ow, let go. Like it's a spiral injury through the tendons all up the arm. And she said, why didn't you tap? And I said, I don't know what tap means. Because it was so obvious to them that had never, it just never even occurred to her that I didn't have any, I moved reasonably well. So they assumed I had training I didn't have. So with that point there, it's good to get somebody who knows what they're doing. It's good to be very cautious about it, and make sure if you have safety protocols like that you discuss them in the training ahead of time, because I'd be having a lot more fun these days if I had been told what tap was before I needed to use it.
Another one of those things that's so painfully obvious, but I've seen people make the mistake. If you are demonstrating a technique, tell the person you're demonstrating on what you're about to do to them before you do the thing. If it's going to be, I'm going to throw you in the air, or it's going to be, I'm going to move a sword near your face, or it's going to be, I'm going to put a lock on a limb and it will feel this sort of joint pressure, or this choke will make you fall asleep because that's what strangle techniques do, so you need to tap.
It's basic consent, right?
People say, this guy knows this move, and start to do the move, and maybe they knew it, but they didn't know you were about to do it then. And
use the words with your mouth parts.
Say what you're going to do, say what you're doing, say what you just did. That's the fundamental.
Exactly.
Helps the teaching, and nothing says fun like a surprise takedown.
Mike.
So, Andrew, you were alluding to the transition from beginner to intermediate as well, and Dillon said something about high throws being safer and things, and I think actually at some point when people are learning wrestling, they've been doing a lot of control work and tying up and some simple takedowns, and then there's each as step along the way, I think there's mental blocks that you have to overcome. And one of them at that point where they're kind of competent at obtaining control, that you have to get them to do more aggressive takedowns and more aggressive throws. So the mental block is that they don't want to do that because they're afraid they're going to hurt somebody. And also they don't want to get hurt. And so that's when I introduce it. We start doing more aggressive things at that point when I know that they're there, and it goes along with breakfall training. But a head and arm is one of the throws that I'll use to illustrate that, because you can take a guy down by putting somebody on. You can drop to your knee and roll them over, and it's pretty safe. And I will throw people. I'll throw my students because I know I can do it and not hurt them. And they go, "Whoa, that didn't hurt." And then I get them to do it with each other. So it's a bit like, the teacher, you let them swing your sword a couple times and then give it back to them, and they go, "Oh, there's something different about the sword." It's a similar thing where you get them to experience this thing, to go through what a throw feels like, and it starts to build the understanding of not only how to fall, but how to throw somebody else safely. So, but that's not for the beginner people. That's for after they've been doing it for a year or two, I think. Yeah.
One thing to throw in there for intermediates and up, once they have a good takedown or a good setup, make them hit the good takedown from a different setup every time live, or make them hit a different takedown. If they got a great setup, make them hit a different time when they go for it.
That's our the primary intermediate sort of bridging the gap from fundamental skill set into play with a chunk of that. When somebody's got full takedown abilities, we would even do alternate. So an I go, you go sort of game where I don't give you the takedown, but I don't really fight it either. And the rule for that is you can't do the same thing twice. You can finish the same way twice, but you can't start the same way twice. So we start altering the constraints and making it more complicated, and then slowly increase the resistance or decrease the timing. But that's right where we would bridge from like really fundamental stuff into more higher level sort of live fire.
A nice asymmetric version of that I've used for many years is one person gets to do all the takedowns. The other one defends, but can only really they can use their torso and their legs to defend. So one person's learning posture and structure, but knows that they're going to get taken down. And it's not like, the ego's out, and it's like, how long can I be a pain in the ass to the guy who's up or lady who's up? And like, okay, and the other one's it's like, okay, no, you can't just do a head. You can't just do a head and arm every time. Now you got to try and like set everything up, and that winds up creating a similar dynamic there.
Asymmetrical goal-oriented training with constraints is, I think, it's freakishly underutilized, and wrestling is the perfect environment to do that sort of stuff really safe. Sorry, giving away.
It also builds character.
Yeah. So, thank you. Got in time. Damn it, we almost missed.
So I just wanted to mention, because I forgot to earlier, that I added a link. I gave Eric a link of Dan Gable coaching kids. And it was when we were talking about intensity and building up intensity. It's an awesome video to watch. He's well, you'll see.
It's one of the links in chat. It'll be in the YouTube video we post and the Facebook post.
If you don't know who Gable is, and you should and you should say a prayer to him before you grapple every time. If you don't know who Gable is and you coach, you probably should go learn, because he's one of the few examples. He's one of the great examples of an incredibly successful competitor who became one of the greatest wrestling coaches of all time. Like
in his career, he lost once.
Yeah.
His entire career, he lost once.
So on your intensity comments, Mike, my intro to grappling, aside from like early Shuai Jiao stuff, was with one of Masayama's Uchideshi, who trained under one of Gable's top students, which was it set the bar for what wrestling was supposed to feel like.
You still have ears?
Yeah, shockingly. The Shuai Jiao, as Jude mentioned, came in for that because my early Shuai Jiao was where I started in martial arts, and all of our training was cover your head and curl into the fetal position.
Nice. Cool. In terms of training stuff, one thing I would like to throw in, make a padded yet somewhat stiff thing that reasonably simulates your weapon and wrestle with it. Right? That's the other piece, is all the drills and stuff we're talking about. You know, one thing that's I think useful and like, you know, for bridging into that is take a, get some rattan, frickin', if a squash ball on one end, bunch of padding on the other, bunch of duct tape, or however you do it. So you get used to wrestling with two of you holding those or one of you holding those. Same thing with a dagger. And it starts to do it again. It's a revealing practice, and it's a really nice way to start bridging from unarmed wrestling into wrestling at the dagger, wrestling at the sword, and armored stuff. And it translates. It's like, and then you start, and it's really interesting. Like, one of my training partners is a former D1 wrestler. And, like first time I ever wound up like hand in clay, okay, here, let's go. It's like, holy shit, he is having way too much fun figuring out all the evil things to do with this. And like, God damn it, my tricks aren't working. But it's really, it's when you go from wrestling some, and then you start including that in, all of a sudden you start finding plays pop out, and the stuff starts making a lot more sense. Like, you come out if you have that background and you have that live training, then you start throwing those implements in, you start coming out the other side with things that will come out when you're fighting.
That ties, I think, really well back into the early why wrestle sort of deal. And we had just the tiniest bit of this at Squatch last year, where you made me accidentally do some of, was it Meyer or Fiore's knife plays?
Yeah.
And it's one of the things where if you build that into your training, that set of the background stuff, you can then add the implements. And it's surprising how much of the classical HEMA sort of thing shows up without you ever having to explicitly look at it. It just makes sense given the framework. Just
I know how a frame and body works. Wait, I got another lever.
Yep, exactly. I guess this goes back a little bit to, I don't remember, Callie, I think, said the thing about safety.
Yep.
And this goes back into the training overall, is scaling the training. I think everybody, not everybody, a lot of people need to understand how new HEMA is, especially competitive HEMA. So the level of wrestling is all over the place competitively, right? And certain organizations are trying to take that into account. There are no weight classes, there are no experience classes. There aren't checks to see if people can fall safely, and so on and so forth. And I've seen this happen. Things I think, from my eye, when I started HEMA, like a year in, there's lots of stuff I saw that I thought was perfectly fine, and it was the throwee's fault. Perfectly fine, right? In retrospect, now that I have more experience, I realize that's like a 5-year wrestler wrestling a person that's been on their one day on the mat, right? That's not safe, and that's not responsible. So that disparity exists, right? So be aware of that when you compete. Be aware of what the rules are, right? And if when you're structuring your training, take that into account too, right? You can say, I maybe prioritize not taking down or recognizing when those situations are happening, right? And if you don't feel comfortable with that, ring yourself out, you know, things like that, you know. Be safe, recognize that maybe you're not at that level. You can see what the level of wrestling is in a given competitive thing, and you're not there, you know, deal with it. Or you can tell that the judges aren't dealing with it well. That's another sign too, right? But you need to try and figure out how to scale that in there as well, right? And then a lot of tournaments are trying to take more responsibility, and they're learning, they've learned that that disparity exists, so they need to do something about it, right? And then creating mechanisms that will just get the community to deal with that better, I think.
I'm gonna jump in here real quick. We are, for the Swordsquatch tournament, the next time there is a physical in-person tournament, we are going to be requiring people to be able to fall to some level in their kit to compete. Exactly what that looks like, I'm going to be working with Stewart and Jude and Andrew and Dillon. And honestly, I know he's willing to give me feedback with some grappling activities to make sure that that's effective. But we are going to do a little bit of gatekeeping there, just to make sure that from the throwee side of things, things are safe, and the people can sort of include grappling at a higher level. That's kind of the goal.
We're at 9:15 now. We've been going for a while. If there are any last questions from the crowd, please throw them out. And let's, hit us now. Concluding remarks from folks. Let's just, last words from people, if or any last thoughts people want to include. Stewart, got anything? Other than
I have nothing in particular and everything in general.
Okay.
I think everybody here loves grappling, so you pick a specific and we could all talk forever, but for those of you who are out there watching this and interested in getting started, there are resources in the manuals that are really interesting. But I think the thing we keep coming back to is to build the skill needed to do these techniques effectively and safely. It helps to have a living coach. And if you can find that, it's going to be a lot smoother for you. If you can't, there are people in your region, there are people in the broader HEMA community who have more experience, people like us who are excited to help others start to wade into these waters. And learning how to wrestle will inform your sensibilities about how you carry yourself and how you fight. Certainly how you wrestle at the sword, but even beyond that, how you wield the sword will be affected by your understanding of biomechanics and tactics that evolve from the experience of wrestling.
Very well put, thank you. Does anyone else have anything else they'd like to add before we wrap this up?
Perhaps unsurprisingly, my coffee hasn't worn off, and I have one tiny last bit. In addition to all the stuff we've covered so far, I do think that was exactly, that was perfectly put, Stewart. One of the things that I would say as maybe my last argument on why to do this is, once you unlock, it's a very low barrier for entry to get started, and it is a huge amount of fun. They let you play with all your friends. One of my mentors described it as the second most fun thing you can do with another human body, and I would agree with that. So it's super fun. Very highly recommend, purely for that in and of itself.
I will save comments. I'll save further comment on that one until there's alcohol involved and privacy. All right. Thanks everyone for being part of this. This has been a hell of a lot of fun. you know, yeah. Thanks to everyone, you know, Mike, Jude, Dillon, Stewart, Brent, you bastard, you should have showed up. You know, thanks to Eric, Justin, Carrie, everyone who's been helping out here. You know, these are very, very odd times. The world is on fire. We're in a plague. You know, the rest of everything else, everything is burning. It's really nice to get a chance to catch up with friends and talk about something we all love doing, particularly something that, like, we're really not getting a chance to do a whole lot of these days because, like, the world plague, that stuff. So next year, hopefully by this time next year, we should actually be able to meet in person again, and all, you know, with beverages, and like this conversation will be over alcohol at night, and there'll be training during the day. All right. Yeah. Oh yeah. I think we'll wrap this up, and I think Eric has some announcements he wants to go through.
Thank you, everyone.
I think we just about hit everything for closing things out. If I had announcements beyond the, for Swordsquatch next year, if you want to compete in open steel, be ready to fall.
Also, everything that we're doing for Swordsquatch this year for Cybersquatch is free to you guys, but if you want to donate, please help next year. You can do that via PayPal at swordsquatch@gmail.com. Links are also on our Facebook thing. Friday evening, we're doing the Swordsquatch, the Cyber Shindig. So if you want to like come participate in that and just a group hangout on Zoom, make sure you register for that on our Facebook page. And yeah, thank you everyone for being here. Vote in November.
Yeah, that actually, if you are an American and registered to vote, you can check your voter registration at vote.org. And yeah, vote in November.